Margaret Hayes stood frozen on her front porch, her trembling hands clutching a bright yellow paper taped to her door. The words eviction notice were printed in bold, unforgiving letters. She reread it again and again, unable to believe what she was seeing. This house, her home of 35 years, was the one her late husband, Daniel, had built with his own hands. Every brick, every nail, every rose in the garden carried a memory of him. She looked down the street of Oak Ridge Estates, a pristine neighborhood run by the most powerful and feared. HOA President Gerald Thompson. His word was practically law here. He claimed the HOA was just keeping the neighborhood in order, but everyone knew he used it to control people. Anyone who questioned him suddenly found themselves fined for imaginary violations. A mailbox that was too tall, a lawn not green enough, or, in one case, curtains not neutral in color. Now, apparently, Margaret was his next target. She walked back inside, the faint scent of Daniel's old cologne lingering near the staircase. The house felt heavier than usual, filled with silence and echoes of a life that used to be. She sat at the kitchen table, her heart pounding, and read the notice again. According to the HOA, her home violated community ownership clauses, meaning, according to Gerald, her husband had never properly transferred the property into her name. How could that be? She whispered. Daniel handled everything before he passed. She pulled out the old wooden box Daniel had kept in his study, filled with insurance papers, mortgage documents, and a sealed envelope marked, "In case of emergency." She had never opened it until now. Just as she was about to break the seal, there was a knock at the door. Margaret flinched. When she opened it, there stood Gerald Thompson himself, wearing his usual smug grin and holding a clipboard. "Mrs. Hayes," he said smoothly, "I see you received your notice. Nothing personal, it's just business. Without proper ownership proof, the HOA has the right to reclaim the property for community development." Margaret stared at him in disbelief. "You can't just take someone's home!" Gerald tilted his head. "Oh, I can. Unless, of course, you leave quietly." Then, without another word, he turned and walked away, leaving Margaret in tears on her porch, clutching the unopened letter that might just hold her salvation. She looked down at Daniel's handwriting on the envelope and whispered, "Please let there be something in here that can stop him." Margaret sat at the kitchen table, the sealed envelope trembling in her hands. Daniel's handwriting was firm and clear. "For Margaret, open only if something ever threatens our home." A tear slid down her cheek. He had known her so well even in death. With careful fingers, she broke the seal and pulled out a folded document. At first glance, it looked like a standard legal paper until she saw the words, "Last Will and Testament of Daniel Hayes." Her breath caught in her throat. She had already been given a will after his death, one that left her everything. So what was this? She read carefully, her eyes widening with every line. This wasn't the same will the lawyer had shown her years ago. This one was newer, dated just 6 months before Daniel's passing, and it contained something the HOA president could never have predicted. Daniel had written, "To my wife Margaret, I leave not only our home but full ownership of the land on which Oak Ridge Estates is built. This property was purchased under my name before the HOA was established, and its title remains under my private trust. The HOA leases this land from me, and my successors shall retain control." Margaret gasped, pressing a hand to her mouth. The HOA didn't own the land. The Hayes family did. That meant Gerald and the entire board were technically her tenants. Before she could fully process it, her phone rang. The caller ID flashed Oak Ridge HOA office. She hesitated, then answered. "Mrs. Hayes," came Gerald's smug voice, "I hope you're preparing to vacate. The board meets tomorrow to finalize your removal." Margaret's voice was steadier than she felt. "Actually, Mr. Thompson, I think we'll need to discuss property ownership first." There was a pause. "Excuse me? I found Daniel's will," she said slowly, "and it changes everything." Gerald scoffed. "Nice try, Mrs. Hayes. The HOA's lawyers reviewed all records years ago. You can't fight this." "We'll see," she said and hung up. The next morning, she dressed in her late husband's favorite color, navy blue, and walked to the HOA office carrying the envelope. Her neighbor, Mrs. Patel, spotted her and whispered, "Margaret, Are you really going to face him? I have to, she replied softly. For Daniel. For everyone he built this place for. As she stepped into the conference room, Gerald and the board members looked up, clearly not expecting her. Margaret laid the will on the table. I believe this meeting is about my property, she said firmly. Gerald's smirk faltered for the first time. The conference room fell into a heavy silence. The walls were lined with photos of perfectly manicured lawns and smiling. Residents, an image. Gerald loved to project, but today his confident mask was slipping. Margaret set Daniel's will on the glossy mahogany table. The paper looked small and fragile, but it carried the weight of everything he had ever built. I believe, she began, her voice steady despite her shaking hands. This document proves my husband owned not only our home, but the land this entire neighborhood sits on. Gerald leaned back in his chair, smirking. A handwritten will? That's hardly legal, Mrs. Hayes. Anyone could have forged that. I thought you might say that, Margaret said quietly. She opened the folder. She'd brought and slid forward a certified copy from the county recorder's office, Daniel's property deed, stamped and signed years before the HOA had even existed. You'll find Daniel's trust was still active when he passed. The trust owns the land, and since I'm his sole heir, the HOA's lease technically belongs to me. A murmur spread through the board members. One of them, a younger man named Curtis, frowned. Wait, are you saying we're paying lease fees to Mrs. Hayes now? That's impossible, Gerald snapped. His face reddened. This community was built independently. Margaret tilted her head. Really? Because Daniel's signature is right here, approving construction permits for every single home, including yours. The room went silent again. Mrs. Patel, who had quietly entered the room to show her support, spoke up. Gerald, I remember when Daniel sold you your lot. You even thanked him for giving you a good deal. Gerald's jaw tightened. That doesn't mean anything. The HOA charter was written on land Daniel still owned, Margaret interrupted. Meaning your authority ends where his trust begins. The color drained from Gerald's face. For the first time, he looked genuinely uncertain. He snatched the will off the table and flipped through it quickly, trying to find something to disprove it. But the notarized signatures and county seals left him no room to argue. Curtis cleared his throat. President Thompson, if this is real, then technically the HOA has been operating under a false ownership claim. We could face lawsuits. Gerald's glare could have burned holes through paper. You think I'm going to let some widow take over this neighborhood? Margaret stood. No, Gerald. You're going to respect what my husband built and stop trying to destroy it. Her words hung in the air like a storm cloud. The next morning, Oak Ridge Estates buzzed with whispers. News of Margaret's confrontation had spread like wildfire. Neighbors who once avoided eye contact with her now waved and stopped by to offer quiet support. Many of them had suffered under Gerald's rule, his endless fines, his arrogance, his threats. But now, for the first time, they sensed the balance shifting. Margaret sat on her porch sipping tea when a silver SUV pulled up. Out stepped two county officials, briefcases in hand. Gerald followed behind them, red-faced and sweating. Mrs. Hayes, one of the officials greeted politely. We're here to verify the validity of your husband's documents. Of course, Margaret said, standing tall. She led them into the living room, where Daniel's old desk still stood. The officials examined the will and the property deeds, comparing signatures, seals, and trust records. After an hour of careful checking, one of them looked up and said simply, Everything appears legitimate, ma'am. The trust is active, and ownership transfers legally to you. Gerald exploded. That's impossible. The HOA owns this land. The official shook his head. No, Mr. Thompson. According to these records, the HOA has been leasing this property from Mr. Hayes's trust. Mrs. Hayes is now the trustee. Margaret folded her arms. Which means, Gerald, you've been sending those HOA dues to me all along. The officials left shortly after, leaving Gerald pale and silent. For the first time, his voice held no power. Within a week, the HOA board called an emergency meeting, this time without Gerald at the head. Curtis, the younger board member, took charge. Mrs. Hayes, he said respectfully, we'd like to apologize for everything that's happened, and we've unanimously voted to remove Gerald Thompson as HOA president. Gerald slammed his resignation papers down and stormed out, muttering under his breath. The room erupted in applause. Margaret took a deep breath, looking around at the faces of her neighbors, people Daniel had once called friends. "Thank you," she said softly. "This community was my husband's dream. He built it to bring people together, not to control them. Let's honor that." From that day on, Oak Ridge Estates changed. The new board worked fairly. The residents began helping each other again, and Margaret became the quiet heart of the neighborhood, the widow who stood her ground with nothing but love and a letter from the past. Sometimes in the evenings, she'd sit on her porch, watching the sunset Daniel used to admire. "You saved me again," she'd whisper, and in the rustling of the garden he'd planted, she almost felt him whisper back,